I just wanted to talk quickly about MeToo movement. Mm-hmm. Tell me your reaction to what's unfolded over the last year. I won't put words in your mouth. You tell me.
Well, there's certainly no shortage of evidence for reprehensible sexual behavior on the part of people who can use power to get away with it. So that's not so good. The Me Too movement, I suspect it probably did some good things and some terrible things. So I would say that there's a dangerous proclivity to abandon the concept of the presumption of innocence. So in university campuses, for example, we're moving towards a preponderance of evidence model. I'm not very happy with that model. I think that's a very big mistake. The presumption of innocence is nothing short of a miracle, and we abandon it at our extreme peril. So I'm not happy with that. I think the believe the victim idea is something that only a fool could conjure up, because it opens the door to unbelievable opportunity for manipulation.
I think that I would disagree with you slightly on that, because I think what that means is what people are arguing for is don't instantly dismiss or disbelieve the victim, right? Which is a very different.
No, that's partly what they're arguing for. There's
thing.
Plenty of people who are arguing for the fundamental attitude to be believe the victim. So some people are arguing to not automatically disbelieve the victim, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to argue for, but that isn't where it ends. Sex by its nature is private. And it's private because if it's made public, it's scandalous. I think what happened to Patrick Brown was a cautionary tale for everyone. 2 allegations demolished our political system for a month. Okay, that's not so good. Well, so what we've done in the past is leave it private. Well, those days are gone. So the question is whether or not anybody can withstand that. I mean, one of the things that Solzhenitsyn wrote about, and I've read other commentators with regards to totalitarian societies, Orwell too, wove this through his work, and also, no, I can't remember the other author, it doesn't matter.
Dostoevsky.
Everybody has a guilty little secret, and the totalitarians never let you forget that. Like, we're all imperfect, we're all flawed, we've all got pasts that where there are secrets that would be best remain hidden, you know, that we have hopefully transcended, you know. I don't know if anybody can tolerate that sort of scrutiny, not only into the public realm, but also into these quasi-judicial apparatuses, like the ones that are being set up at the universities. You think the courts do a bad job, you wait till you see what the universities do. It's hard to set up a court system. You know, and the fundamental problem with the sexual assault cases basically is that, well, there are no witnesses. Well, how in the world do you adjudicate that? Believe the accuser. Well, no. Not reflexively, obviously, unless you're naive beyond belief and think that no one would ever use an accusation out of confusion, let's say, forgetfulness, or maliciousness. If you think any of those things, then the amount you know about human beings could be put in a thimble. So we have a presumption of innocence for a reason, but we're replacing that with believe the accused and preponderance of evidence, and it's part of the assault on English common law, which is regarded by the postmodern neo-Marxists as just another narrative and part of the patriarchal tyranny. The law schools they're not as bad as the faculties of education or social work, but that's about all you can say for them. You see the same thing in criminal behavior. Hardly anyone is a criminal.
Yeah.
Then if you take the fraction of people who are criminals, most of them are like 1- 2-time criminals, right?
Yep.
But there's a professional hardcore group that commit all the crimes.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing with sexual assault and sexual harassment. Well, you don't want to confuse the action of some of the men with all of the men. Like, it's really important to get that distinction right, and we're not getting that distinction right at all.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, is that it's critical to differentiate first of all, among the offenses, surely.
Well, you'd hope so.
And among the perpetrators or alleged perpetrators, and yet now the discussion seems to be turning to, to almost an attack on the masculinity of corporations, hierarchies and in companies, and how is it possible that we don't recognize, well, we do, most of us, but there's that minimum at one end, and then there's somebody who's sexually assaulting women, physically raping women.
Well, some of it is that there's a concerted effort on the part of the radical postmodern left to erase the distinction between categories of criminal behavior.
Categories is all we got.
Yeah, but the postmodernists don't like categories. You see, that's if you go way down into the structure of the current culture wars, what you see is that at the very base of it, there's two things that the postmodern neo-Marxists are, they're full-scale assaulting. One is categorization, because they believe that the only function of categorization is power. The other one is that there's a war on competence, because if you admit that there are hierarchical structures that are predicated on competence, then you have to grapple with the issue of competence, and you have to grapple with the issue of valid hierarchy. If all hierarchy is power, and all power is corrupt, and all corrupt power is tyranny, then you can't admit to competence. But the downside, there's a terrible price to be paid for that, because every value system produces a hierarchy. So if you dispense with the hierarchy, you dispense with the value systems.
Recently, the founding director and creative director, I think he was, Albert Schultz from the Soul Pepper Theatre Company, was the latest in Canada to be accused of what sounds like a pretty wide range of offenses. Why are women coming forward now about events that happened 15 or 20 years ago?
Okay, well, let's address that two ways. I mean, the first, there's been an adolescent insistence since the early 60s that sexual behavior can be rule-free. Now, a lot of that was generated as a consequence of the birth control pill, right? Because it was like, that's a biological revolution. All right, all of a sudden women can control their reproductive function in principle. Question one, what does that make women? Because now they're a new biological entity, right?
Yeah.
And so it's wide open. What are women now? We don't know. The next thing that's wide open is, well, maybe there are no rules for sex then. There's an impulsive part of human beings, it's associated with the sexual drive, obviously, that would love it if there were no rules governing sexual behavior, because then it would be all orgies all the time with no consequences, right? And so, but the problem is that all of that's untrue, because you can't divorce sexuality from emotion. You also can't divorce it from responsibility. You can't divorce it from family. You can't divorce it from respect. You can't divorce it from children. Like, it's so central. You can't divorce it from power. You can't divorce it from tyranny or love. Like, it's central, and it involves all those other things. And so there are rules. The question is, what are the rules? And the answer is, no one knows. So there's going to be mistakes everywhere, all the time. Where do you draw the line between a sexual invitation and harassment? Well, like a cynic would say, anything unwanted is harassment. Well, how the hell is the person who's making the offer supposed to determine that beforehand?
Yeah, you make the offer or the invitation in part to find out
whether
if
it's welcome.
wanted.
Yes, and the terrible thing about that in part is that it's almost always men who do that, right? Men make the offer. And almost always it's rejected, and it's almost always rejected even by women who might be interested under some circumstances. Now, the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is that women bear a much heavier price for sexual activity than men do. So they're the ones that are going to say no. The problem is that we need to know exactly where the rules are, and we don't.
In this climate, though, where we're not sure of the rules, we're not sure where the lines are, when does a glance become a sexual offense?
Well, it's a sexual offense right away if it's a microaggression.
Tell people what a microaggression is. I think we all hear that now, and we're not really sure what it means. I'm not, anyway.
A microaggression is any act, no matter how subtle, that makes the recipient uncomfortable regardless of the intent of the perpetrator.
Good grief.
Right.
Good grief.
Yeah, because we're getting away from intent, eh? It's all consequence.
It's all how it's received.
Yes. And so and that's being written into the law very rapidly, by the way. So we're moving from a legal system where intent matters to a legal system where consequences matter, which is really the eradication of the legal system. But it doesn't matter, because the postmodern radicals who increasingly occupy the law schools believe that Western law is a patriarchal and oppressive tradition, and that undermining it and destroying it by doing things like removing due process and insisting on preponderance of evidence and going for consequence rather than intent, that's fine, because all they're doing is tearing down a terrible tyrannical patriarchal structure. Having never had the fortune to spend any time in an Iranian prison, for example, they're not very good at distinguishing between what constitutes a tyranny and what constitutes a free society.
Until we figure all this stuff out, assuming we will at some point, the sexual stuff I'm talking about, can ordinary men and ordinary women continue to work together?
A lot of it's emergent self-protection. You know, men say, don't ever have a meeting with a woman when the door's closed. In fact, I've been told that at the university. Never have a meeting with a student with the door closed. It's like, I ignore that because there's no damn way I'm doing that. But that's common practice. I don't know the answer to whether or not men and women can work together en masse, because it's not under the current conditions.
It's highly relevant to me to distinguish gradations of sexual misbehavior. And when I see an article like the one in BuzzFeed that didn't seem inclined to make those distinctions, they talked about actions that were essentially assaults in the same breath as behavior that really was nothing other than an inept attempt to flirt, right? Complimenting somebody in a way that they found undesirable. If you're not going to make those distinctions, it's very hard to take even the serious allegations seriously. But this is something that we have to be very careful about, because it is easy to just destroy people's reputations based on mere allegation. And I say this as somebody who has been on the receiving end of this kind of thing, not for anything like sexual harassment, but charges of racism based on my criticism of Islam. Those are everywhere. And if people could have made those stick, they would have. They'll try again tomorrow to do that. I feel very cautious in accepting this kind of thing, but these kinds of allegations are different. These are individual people claiming that another person did certain things to them. That leaves much less scope for delusion and bias than judging whether or not somebody's views are racist, say. So I certainly don't accept everything that's been said about Lawrence at face value, but there's enough there to worry me. And that is not something that I could have said before the BuzzFeed article broke, and it's not something that I could have said on stage that night in Phoenix. But subsequent communication has pushed me into this place. And I'll leave it at that. More generally on the MeToo movement, and this is something I did say in Phoenix, I'm certainly biased toward believing all women who say that a guy was creepy, right? I mean, that is my bias. And I have to correct for that bias in ways so as to give someone a presumption of innocence before more facts are in, which in certain cases is only decent to do. Again, I think it's hugely important to distinguish the ends of the continuum here, the Harvey Weinsteins and Bill Cosbys of the world, from the Louis C.K.'s of the world, from the Aziz Ansari's of the world. I mean, there is a continuum here that stretches from true criminality and rape, right, for which people should spend decades in prison, to sexual and interpersonal pathology that doesn't entail any real coercion of people necessarily, to bad dates and bad flirting and semi-autistic behavior, to just frank misunderstandings. It stretches all the way to cases where, had the guy been desirable to the woman, his behavior would have totally passed as flattery and successful flirting. But because he was undesirable, it was viewed as unwanted attention, and in some cases as being classed as a kind of assault or a kind of harassment. I have no idea how single people are going to navigate this space in the workplace and at conferences. This seems now incredibly fraught, and we should all want to find some more adult way to navigate these waters.